It's worked first time. Happy days.
It's like we know what we're doing.
Exactly. That's good,
How are
isn't
you?
it? How you? I'm doing good. How are you?
Very good, man. Very good. Getting used to
Good.
being a dad, which is
I bet.
the only reason I'm not where I would current normally be is because his room is the other side of the wall and it's like paper thin, so he'd just hear me and you chatting for the next hour
Happy days. So priority goes to him all
long.
times. But yeah, lovely to see you. It's been a wee while since we've spoke. So, for anybody who's tuning in, me and Darren are friends. We know each other. But for anybody who doesn't know who Darren is, Darren, take it away. Give a little bit about yourself.
So what do I start? I am what we call an adaptive adventurer. So that means that, we'll talk about this in a minute, but I have a disability, I have a spinal cord injury, but I adventure despite that, and regardless of that, you just find ways to adapt. Hence, we don't say disabled adventurer, we say adaptive adventurer. And a bit like yourself, for the last couple of years, I've been developing a career as a speaker, which we
Amazing.
both know is rewarding, challenging, and everything in between.
That's it. Many descriptive words can be used to describe a life as a motivational speaker. But yes, anyway, it's great to have you here. It's great to see you again. And yeah, I'm eager to explore this idea of masculinity because you and I have had many discussions about both our lives and what we've been through and all these things. But the idea of masculinity hasn't really came up. So it's going to be interesting to see how we came up. Obviously, we spoke about it recently with this potential IMEX, but in terms of when we've been together, it's not something we've discussed initially. So I'm just eager to get going and see what we're going to find out about masculinity with disability. Now, I guess let's take it right back to the start. You were in the army, am I right in saying, when you were younger?
Yeah, so I had my career was as a sort of started a career as a history teacher of all things,
Yeah.
but alongside that, my life was that as a profession, as a passion, mountaineering, and as like a side project, I was part of the Army Reserve and part of the SAS Reserve. Um,
Amazing.
so just in case life wasn't hectic and enough, I don't know why, but there was always some attraction to the forces for me, and I think even though I didn't want to do it full time,
Yeah,
I wanted to challenge myself outside of work and to prove that I could do it. I
yeah,
think.
100%, 100%. And I guess the first question then goes to your life. I know that wasn't your full life, you were doing it on the side, but
Mm.
your idea of masculinity, either growing up or within the army reserves and seeing what you were saying, what was your idea of what it meant to be a man? What did you see masculinity as being when you were younger like that?
I think particularly with the military, it was you looked at physical traits,
Yeah,
you looked at physical traits and confidence, and I always remember. So the way that selection for the SAS and the SAS Reserve work is you volunteer, so no one's forcing you to do it to start with, and you turn up on day one, and you're stood on a parade ground with maybe 150. There are probably about 150 guys on mine,
yeah,
and I was looking over like both my shoulders, looking at guys taller, physically stronger, and I was like, I've got no chance here. Like these guys are meaner, tougher, fitter, and I just thought they were everything that I wasn't.
okay,
Uh, so I think back then I looked at masculinity in a very physical sense.
okay,
And actually, I think that the first kind of hint that I was probably wrong was that that selection process is really tough. You spend 6 months being what they would call beasted over mountains in South Wales, and the majority of people quit.
yeah,
There's no one shouting at you. There's no one forcing you to make the next mountaintop. And one by one, you saw these tall, strong, fit, mean-looking guys. And I'm like the guy that's going around saying hi to everybody and being really friendly. And I feel like I don't fit. But actually, at the end, you had 8 lads left who weren't perhaps the most confident or physically the grittiest,
yeah,
but the guys that knew about what we talk about: resilience, perseverance, adapt and
yeah,
overcome. So I think that's when my mindset towards masculinity started to change. But
okay,
that's actually around the time that my life then changed completely.
yeah.
And I feel quite lucky that perhaps I was starting to unwrap what masculinity really meant prior to the day that changed my life.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. You've already spoke there about attaching masculinity and physicality.
Mm.
And what we're about to go on to and talk about your accident, we'll explore that idea more and probably break down that barrier of what you used to think right initially about masculinity and physicality. So let's go into it. Tell us about that day, what you remember, and then let's explore the aftermath.
Yeah. So I always say I was doing what I loved. And like, for me, if I was ever going to have an accident, you'd want it to be doing the thing that you love doing. And for me, climbing was that. And you know, there's inherent risk, that there are factors that are beyond your control, and you roll the dice every time you start a climb, just like every time you get in a car.
Yeah.
But you can't think of it that way. And I didn't think of climbing like that. It was risk assessed, but not risk averse, because you're trying to push your limit. And on that day, I was at a rock face inside the Snowdonia National Park, 300 foot. It's a vertical. When you stand at the bottom, it's intimidating. You look up and you've got these 4 tiers stacked on top of each other. And I was with my best friend, a guy that I climbed with for a decade, the guy that I owe everything to in so many different ways. And that day with lead climbing, it's the lead climb that takes the risk, because you're ascending a blank wall of rock and you've got to put your protective gear in as you go. The guy below you, which in this case was Matt, was feeding the rope through. And a couple of hours later, we're just 40 foot from the top, 40 foot from going home. And I walk along this ledge away from Matt. I start to ascend, and it's at the limit of what I could do. It was maybe not pretty. It was a bit gritty to get up to the top, but I got up to the top. And I had that moment of feeling like you conquered the world. And it was as I then looked down at my best friend, who's on this 6 foot wide ledge below me. And as I give him the thumbs up, I indicate I'm safe and that he can switch off a little bit. It's then as I turn and my back is to the drop, the section of rock I happened to be stood on that you could never have predicted collapsed beneath my feet. And it was a significant, a ton of rock. And me in it went, in an instant, and a split second later, I've been, thrown from the top of World's End, and very aware of my own, in the seconds that followed, very aware of my own mortality. And in my mind, I was about to die. And I thought about all of the people in my life that I was never going to see again, and truly believed in that moment, mum, dad, sister, best friends. But I somehow hit that little ledge, and hit it, but I continued to tumble. And without intervention, I was going to tumble and slip another 260 feet to my death. And as I'm tumbling, I close my eyes because I know what comes next. And it's as I close my eyes, I then feel this intense pressure on my rib cage, and I feel like I've stopped. And my first thought was like, is this what death feels like? Am I dead? And I open my eyes. I'm not dead. There's the sun beating down, and I've got Matt's body on top of mine. And he just sprinted from where he was stood to intercept me before I slipped and fell. And the only thing he could do was throw himself on top of me. And he did that, not knowing whether it was going to take both of us or whether it was going to work. And yeah. So, that's what you got best friends for, to save your life. He doesn't let me forget it, bless him. But
I wouldn't.
It's the ultimate, trump card for most things.
Yeah.
But I knew, he dragged me back from the edge a little bit, and I think I knew within a matter of minutes that I was seriously injured, because you can put so much down to shock. And I think initially the fact I couldn't stand up, I put down to shock, and then a few minutes later, I'm just acutely aware that I can't feel anything below my chest.
Wow.
And that was the start of a 3-hour rescue that involved mountain rescue, Coast Guard helicopter. And ultimately 3 hours later, you're being sort of put on a spinal board and winched up and to be flown somewhere. God knows where at that point. So, yeah.
Wow. I've heard it before, and we've spoke about it, and yet each time you tell me it, it still sends chills down my spine. Like it's an incredible story. It's an incredible story for many reasons, and obviously we'll go into the resilience side of it, of your recovery. But there's teamwork in a nutshell. Also that loyalty and that best friend for you. It's an incredible, and it makes I can tell the emotion in your face when you speak about it, and I can feel it myself. So it's incredible, and I'm so thankful that you're here today to be able to speak and share what you've learned and also help people along the way. Now, let's look at the recovery. You're in the hospital, and I bet you that recovery must have been very difficult. So many things going through your mind. Let's go into this idea of masculinity. What did you think of, or did you think of it of, in terms of how your next step looks like as being a man?
Yeah, I think the thing is, when you're lying in a hospital bed, and it's 5 months of intensive rehab, and it started with 6 weeks of what they call bed rest, where you're immobilized in bed for 6 weeks. You can't sit up, you can't roll, you can't feed yourself, you can't go to the toilet yourself. Everything's done for you. So all of those physical traits that we spoke about earlier that for me were quite attached to masculinity, you're suddenly without it, and you are locked in your head. You're locked in a bed, locked in your head, and there's lots of like powerful thoughts going through it. Because someone's just told you, like the day after my accident, somebody said to me, "You broke your back, you severed your spinal cord. You're never going to walk again. Regardless of how hard you try, nothing that we can do that you can do." And you go straight into that 6-week period of lying on your back, and your thoughts are like so powerful, and you're trying to come to this acceptance of what's happened, but you've still got this kind of, you're going through that change curve of anger, grief, denial. I will overcome, I will stand back on my feet again. And it completely, like, I don't know, I think when I look back, I didn't appreciate at the time how you get stronger through these experiences. And actually, if we talk about masculinity and what it means to be an alpha male, what it means to be a real man, with all of that other stuff stripped away, which is the kind of external facade of a bloke, the ability to run to the top of a hill and post it on Instagram and be like, look how fit I am. You're left with what it means to be a man just in here, as an individual. Can you be strong in those difficult moments, but also can you be vulnerable, and can you have the humility to accept and say to people, you know what, I need you right now. And I think for me, those 5 months in hospital were an awful lot about embracing vulnerability, embracing humility. It's a humbling journey. The amount of times you get things wrong, you have to be humble. But the connections that I was building with not just the professionals like the physios and the OTs and the nurses and the doctors, but also friends that I'd had in my life for 10, 12, 15 years, there's all of a sudden like another layer of connection and friendship, because for the first time ever, I was like being vulnerable and saying, I need you to help me get through this.
Yeah, incredible. And you were seeing an emotional vulnerability develop, but also there was a physical vulnerability there initially, where you've probably thought you've had that physicality where you could run up to the top of a hill and post it on Instagram, do whatever you need to do. But then all of a sudden your life's changed and there was that physical vulnerability too. How did you view the physical vulnerability initially? Because obviously what you do now, it's incredible and it's less of a vulnerability, but right initially.
But at the time, so different. Like now, I kind of laugh when I don't really perceive myself as disabled. You know what I mean? Like, it sounds stupid, I'm in a wheelchair, but back then, I was really, I don't know. I was in a relationship with somebody while I was in the hospital, and I just hoped that they saw me for me, and they didn't see me for this wheelchair thing, because I was acutely aware. You were surrounded by people that were in wheelchairs that would even come into your room that were really, it sounds harsh, but overweight, that would like tap their bellies and be like, oh, look forward to having one of these. Like it was an inevitability about having a disability, you would then be out of shape. And for me, I was kind of like just sitting there thinking, oh my God, please no, I don't want to lose this love of health or being, physically fit. And then a couple of weeks before my discharge, that girl that I loved unconditionally, that I would have done anything for, just came in one day and said, I should have done this right at the start, but I can't do it. And, she broke my heart, stood up, turned around, walked out. I never saw that person again. And that moment, I think, challenged my sense of self and what it meant to be a man, and an attractive man, more than any other single event in my life. Because suddenly I was like, oh my God, the most important person in my life can't love me for who I am. Because of what happened. And I think I'd be lying if I said it took probably about 2 years to psychologically come to terms with that and actually feel like I had some value to the opposite sex again, that, I was still a man that could be desired, because my experience to date was the one person I know loves me and can't love me enough.
It's an interesting one, because my next question is going to be about how did other people view your vulnerability, physical vulnerability at that point, and did you feel like their opinions impacted your idea of masculinity? And there's a perfect example of that probably did impact your
Yeah.
initial fear of masculinity because someone had rejected you for this supposed vulnerability. Was there anybody else in your family that, or friends or anything, that found it difficult to come to terms with?
Yeah, I think my dad did. You know, me and you have spoken at length about like mental health and suicide prevention and stuff. My dad was already going through a really difficult time in his life. My parents had separated. Mentally, he was kind of struggling. And I think all of a sudden you introduce this element of his son has sustained a life-changing injury, and I think there was feelings of guilt there. As you know, I think parents almost want to own it and say, "Why couldn't it have been me?" You know, because no parent wants to see their child. I would, God, you know, I've been a dad for 3 weeks, and I couldn't. I would take a bullet, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So my dad did. You know, so the spectrum was on one end you had my partner who left because of the disability, and that, like you said, you know, it made me not feel like I was man enough.
Yeah.
And this disability inherently meant that I was less of a man now. And then, you know, I had my dad who I don't think he ever really knew how to deal with it or come to terms with it, perhaps. But then in the middle, I had this horde of, you know, a harem of mates that couldn't care less. They were like, you want to learn to kayak? Let's go and buy a kayak. You want to do this? Let's go and do it. Let's, you know, the amount of like farm gates that I was thrown over by one mate to another mate just so we could get onto the river. Or so I think there was a mix of enablers and empowerers that when I said to them, this is what I want to do, said, right, let's make it happen. And then at the periphery, you had people that found it really difficult, you know, to come to terms with it.
And you see there, I was going to say about, did you find it difficult to fit in with different groups of people with your vulnerability? But, you know, your friends took you along the ride with them, which is great and probably rare in many
But
cases.
I found it difficult. It's interesting. I found it difficult to be in groups with other people that were in wheelchairs.
Okay.
Because part of my coping mechanism, I don't think I've ever said this out loud, but part of my coping mechanism was to distance myself. Once I left school, I wanted to return to normal and to my normal life and to my normal like set of friends. And the reality was that before having a disability myself, I didn't know anybody with a disability.
Yeah.
So I found it really emotionally difficult to go to events where it was being hosted by a charity to introduce people to, you know, disabled sport, and I'd suddenly be surrounded by 10 people in wheelchairs.
Yeah.
I found it awkward, you know, because I think I was psychologically still coming to terms with it, and the way I viewed myself and the way I perceived someone in a wheelchair didn't quite match yet.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I completely understand where you're coming from. And I guess it leads to my next point of view with other people in a similar boat than you. From your experience, from what you've seen, you know, I feel like you've had a real good amount of people around you who have rallied around you and brought you back. Now, from what you've seen from other people, have you felt like their ideas of masculinity and vulnerability has been really impacted by their disability to the point where they've struggled to actually ever get away from it?
Yeah, I think so. I think me and you probably both talk about perspective and the way that you like look at something.
Yeah.
And I think for me, you know, to use my accident as an example, I could perceive that day as the end of my life worth living.
Yeah.
But it then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because that's the way you see it. So your whole framing is skewed around the future will never be as good as the past.
Yeah.
And I meet so many people. It's so sad, you know. Like I think if you took 100 people that had a spinal injury, and like there were 50 people on the ward with me, so 50 people in the same year had a spinal injury. 25 of them had come to terms with it, put it in perspective. You know, there's a guy I met who was involved in a rugby scrum collapse, broke his neck. He was paralysed from the neck down. And initially he was on a ventilator, he was on life support machines, and he recovered, you know, but would never recover the ability to use his arms or his legs. And I remember sitting down next to him, and he just said, you know what, Darren, I was just so scared they were going to turn the machine off and I'd never see my girls again. Wow. So he came to the terms of the fact he had a severe spinal injury because of the family that he did not, under any circumstances, want to leave behind.
Yeah.
So for every one of me or him that could kind of put it in perspective and kind of look to the future with a bit of hope and optimism and thanks that, you know, I got to see all those people that in the 3 or 4 seconds of falling, I didn't believe I would.
Yeah.
You had 25 individuals that really, I don't know, like it really shifted their perspective of self in a very negative sense.
Okay.
And I keep in touch with some of these people, and we're now 8 years later, and they're still stuck psychologically where they were 8 years ago. And it breaks my heart, because I think you can say as much as possible and share some of the things that helped me.
Yeah.
And I think that journey of acceptance is difficult. And I think, the guys that I'm referencing here, their view of masculinity changed for such a negative, to such a negative angle, that they've never really recovered, and the perception of their confidence or their character, it is a shadow of what perhaps they were before, and they think because they're disabled they can't, whereas I think I've become more of a man because of what's happened, because we'll talk about this, but because of embracing vulnerability, embracing humility, embracing empathy, the level of empathy that are in my relationships with my friends that was never there before, like is seismically different, and it's just made those friendships stronger. It's like, you know that you can level with them, be honest with them, be vulnerable with them, and that's the two-way street. Once you open it up, you then start to see it from them, and I think that's really powerful.
I feel like this is biased for me because I know you, but I feel like for men in your situation, it could go either way. But if you know yourself, where when you have an alleged vulnerability initially, you can see how that will then make them embrace vulnerability in so many other ways in other aspects of their life, because there's already that idea of vulnerability out in the open for everybody to see. Whereas so many men who are able-bodied and everything, like they hold it in because they don't want to see people, they don't want anybody to see any vulnerability. But with yourself, I'm saying a vulnerability, I'm saying initially that idea of vulnerability, I don't think you're a vulnerable person, but my point is that initially people will see there's a vulnerability there. So it can break down barriers for men, but also in the other breath, it can be so difficult for men, and the ones you've just alluded to there, it can be so difficult to claw back that idea of what it actually means to be a man. And I bet you, correct me if I'm wrong, but you've probably had more open conversations and more vulnerable conversations with people who are in your similar situations than maybe people who aren't, potentially, maybe not.
Yeah,
but it can go either way.
I think there's this level of understanding that you've each been through a really profound shared experience, and you each know what the struggle feels like. You each know how difficult it is to kind of go through that change curve of denial, anger, grief, acceptance, and growth. So you can kind of level with each other, and there's no, I look back at the old me and mountaineering and the military stuff. There's so much bravado. There's so much kind of like, oh, that was well easy, mate. But actually, like you at the time felt like you were about to die. But it's just this alpha male wall that goes up. But it only takes one person to say, you know what, I was at the limit of quitting, and then the guy next to you kind of goes, oh, fuck me too. So I think once that wall comes down, you can connect on a real level.
Yeah, definitely. I guess this is what I was going to say now is how does your idea of masculinity evolved? We've seen already, but what is it currently at? How do you see yourself as this masculine male in society? Where is it sitting at now since your injury and your evolution?
Good question. I think I would never I don't think I'll ever stand up and say, hi, I'm Darren Edwards, I'm an alpha male. I don't think those words will ever come out of my mouth. But I know that I can be physically different to the me of 8 years ago. Yeah, that's granted. But I'm a stronger man now because there's the mental strength which leads to physical strength, and not vice versa. So I think you can be quietly confident, understated, humble. I think all of the, what it's like. You get up on stage as a speaker. Me and you both do this, and it'd be very easy to kid yourself that you are you are the man kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm like, we are the one on stage talking to everybody else. And for me, it's all about just telling your story, but being humble in the way that you tell it, but not just trying to be humble, just really be humble, and have humility. And yes, me and you are where we are now, but we both went through a period of our lives where things were really difficult and could have gone one way or the other on the flip of a coin. And I think we always need to remember that. So I think for me, not just my accident, but what followed is really grounding, and it will remain grounding regardless of the accolades that may follow it. So I think, to be a real strong man, it's to have that humility, that empathy for others, the ability to connect with someone on an emotional level, not feel the need to have bravado that you've always got it. Like the last 3 weeks, I'll be honest, being a dad is the toughest 3 weeks of my life.
Yeah.
It really has been. And there've been moments where I've just said to my partner, I'm like, God, this is a lot more difficult than I thought. And then it opens up the conversation with her, who she says the same thing. It's not this kind of pretense of I've always got this covered, don't you worry.
Yeah. And so, right, so here's a good question. And so you are a parent now. Is it? It's a son, isn't it?
Son,
Got a
yes.
boy.
So
What's his name?
Mac.
Okay, Matt. So how do you want and how will you help shape him and his idea of masculinity as he grows into a young adult and eventually a man? What do you think? I know it's difficult now, you're 3 weeks in.
$1 million question.
But what do you think is important for young people nowadays? Because young people are at a crossroads, and it's very difficult for them. I know that adolescence thing that was the TV show that's been out recently, and it's got a lot of people discussing about what we need to do for our boys in society. Have you got any ideas at the minute, or are you just taking it one step at a time?
No, so we had to think that. So we've gone about it the unconventional way. My spinal injury does mean that naturally we can't really conceive. So we went through IVF, no luck. So we've adopted. It. So we've been plonked into being parents to a boy that's just turned 1. This gorgeous baby boy who's had a bad start to life, but we're giving him this platform. But part of that process, you're getting questioned by the social workers as to what are the values that you will raise this child by, like Darren as a father. So they've asked the same question you've done.
Okay.
And I've always said that, I will not be a pushy parent, but I'll be supportive in his endeavors and whatever, he chooses to do. If he wants to be an adventurer, God, that's right up my street. But if he wants to pursue a passion that I don't have, I'll be there step by step with him. But I think it's about instilling the discipline that, good things come from hard work, and hard things, for me, mountaineering was the perfect way to develop a sense of confidence and self-belief. And, you overcome tricky moments where things don't go to plan. You fail, you get back up, you go again. So for me, I think what I hope to instill in him as my son is that it's not all about talent. It's not all about natural ability. It is about your perseverance, your resilience, your discipline, your humility, your kind of respect for others as well. And I think, like you said, the youth now are at a crossroads. We sound old when we talk like this.
I know, don't we?
But, it is a crossroads. I think society's going to go one of two ways. Kids are going to become more insular and wrapped up in this digital world, or society's going to throw it back the other way, where we should be throwing it, where we encourage our children to be outside, to get dirty, fall over, get back up, scrape a knee, go again. And I think for me, that's the world that I will embrace as a father with him, because that's the world where he will develop his character, where he'll develop his confidence, where he'll learn to fail and to overcome the failure and push through. So I'm nervous about it. I won't lie. I'm nervous about it, Dad, because I really want to do a good job.
Yeah. I can see the want to be the best possible version and best possible dad for your kid, and that's great to see. And I guess, for me, in my experience of having a military family and dad, where psychological safety didn't exist in our environment, where it was difficult because he was very pushy. He pushed me to play football, and yes, I was a very good footballer, but he pushed me to become the best footballer out there. And I felt that pushiness in a negative way, where then I didn't want to open up and say, you know what, I'm struggling with this, or I've made a mistake, or I'm not good enough, or whatever. And it's important, we talk about this in workplaces all the time about how we can create psychologically safe environments in the workplace. How do we create psychologically safe environments in the home? Because when we do that, we've got a better view of masculinity with our children growing up, where they will have a better view of it because vulnerability exists. But the big question is, how do we do it? How do we have psychologically safe environments? Now, you've already said there, don't be pushy. That's the number one. That's a big tick. How else do you feel like you can, obviously I know it's hard in the minute you're thinking, what am I going to do? But how do you think that will look like?
I hope it's just that he knows that I'm approachable.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, if we throw it back to that rehab process, the psychiatrist was like, we're going to have a meeting once a week. It's a given. But my door's always open. So, if I ever did have those difficult moments, or a moment where I wanted to share how I felt, I knew there was a safe space to do it.
Yeah.
But there was no pressure to either.
Yeah.
So I think for me, I look at some of my friends that I think are really good role models for parents. I'm very lucky to be surrounded by mates with young children that set a really good example. And I look at that and I think, I want to be a bit like that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of that is about, being approachable to your children, and I think maybe being real with them makes them real with you.
Yeah,
if you say daddy's struggling a little bit today, they're probably going to be more inclined to say they've had a tough day at school, because they know that they can be real with you and you're being real with them.
And I think even from a young age, we know when our parents, whether it's our dad or mums, we know when there's something not right. Yeah. And I know they're going to be sheltering so many things with us, but there is that element where still there has to be some kind of open communication / vulnerability, because if we see them not opening up, we see them just shutting it up, even though we know that something's up, then of course then we think, well, that's what we do as adults. And then it leads into how we become when we grow older. Anyway, we weren't even talking about parenthood, but we've brought it up, but it's good. So I guess let's finish off with this question. What would your advice be for other disabled people, especially men, who feel less of themselves following the disability? Let's say a man who feel less of a man, their ideas of masculinity's warped now. What would your advice be to help them?
I think for me, it's the thing I was starting to realise pre-accident that my accident only emphasised, which is that your masculinity isn't linked to your physicality. Your masculinity is linked to what's in here. And I think for me, the individuals I see that have struggled and continue to struggle is because their physical sense, their physical self defines their character, and not the character doesn't define them. And it's difficult, isn't it? It's so easy to say to somebody to be resilient. It's harder to explain how to do it. Yeah. But I think for me, I consider myself very lucky that I was already starting to think, it's not all about the strongest, fittest, fastest, meanest. It's about kind of, your determination to push through regardless. Yeah. So I think for me, if there is somebody there who's disabled recently or years in the past, 8 years later, like myself, it is, allow yourself to be defined by the person you are, not the thing you sit on or stand on.
Love it. I love it. What way to end? That's quotes right there, so it is, isn't it?
Yeah, sometimes I say stuff that makes sense. The rest.
No, it's been brilliant. It's been brilliant. Thank you so much for joining me. We could keep chatting all day about this, and maybe we'll explore more things going forward. But I really appreciate your time and your openness and vulnerability. So thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Yes, you too. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.